Welcome everybody to Candid Conversations with a CMO, a SurgeonMasters community E-Gagement. Our spotlighted guest tonight is CMO Dr. Philip Stahel, a former orthopedic surgeon turned chief medical officer. Before I introduce Phil, I'd like to set some ground rules for tonight. The first part of this evening is being recorded. And when we begin the second portion, the discussion part, we will turn off the recording. We ask that you not reference what other attendees share in the non-recorded portion. This is to maintain confidentiality, protect anonymity, and encourage an open and honest discussion. The key objectives tonight are to support each other and take something away that positively contributes to your life or practice. If you have a question during Phil's presentation or during the moderated session, please type it into the chat, and we definitely will welcome questions. Following our moderated discussion with Phil, we're going to move into breakout rooms for small group discussion and return to the main room for a final wrap up, highlighting some lessons learned. And during this section of the agenda, we want the discussion to be as relevant to you as possible. To do that, we're hoping to create breakout rooms segmented by practice background type. We may make some modifications depending upon the number of attendees this weekend. Right now, we're thinking of separating them out as first group being private or independent contractor, a second group is academic, a third group is employed, and then we will keep the main room open for anyone needing assistance to change rooms, although you should be able to do that on your own, and then to allow an opportunity for additional discussion, and obviously the room to come back in for our final wrap up. I think that covers it on the basics. I want to now introduce our guest, Dr. Philip Stahel. Dr. Stahel is the Chief Medical Officer at the Medical Center of Aurora and Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital, Centennial Hospital in Aurora, Colorado. He's a professor of orthopedics and professor of neurosurgery and faculty at Rocky Vista University College of Osteopathic Medicine. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for the kind introduction, and good evening, friends. The most honorable accomplishment you forgot to mention, Jeff, is that I'm one of the 3 amigos, and you keep inviting me, so I'm truly honored, and I hope that I can contribute some valuable parts of the discussion tonight. A brief summary: I'm from Switzerland originally, that's my accent, and I trained in Switzerland and Germany as a general surgeon, general trauma surgeon, and then specialized in orthopedic trauma and spine trauma. And I've been in the United States now for 15 years and chief medical officer for 4 years. We have 7 hospitals within the HCA system here in the Denver market, and we are affiliated with Rocky Vista University from a GME perspective. So I'm able to continue my academic teaching and research, which I truly enjoy. And Jeff asked me to give a brief overview on why that transition from orthopedic trauma surgeon to CMO, and maybe explain a little bit on also my perspective as a CMO, how I feel that you all could possibly leverage your CMO at your facility in a different aspect. Traditionally, it used to be when you get a call from the CMO, it's typically punitive. And I remember when I first started my job, the first thing I wanted to do is to get to know everyone, build relationships, and understand what their concerns are. And obviously it takes a while to peel that onion and truly understand what the concerns are, because most of us are self-sufficient. We built workarounds, and the last thing we want to do is end up in an executive administration office and have a conversation with the CMO. However, I strongly believe, and possibly my strongest incentive to transition was, I wanted to do it different than what I've seen in the past. And more frequently than not, I felt that the CMO could be an impediment to successful clinical practice, to clinical excellence, quality and patient safety, as opposed to a promoter and a supporter of the medical staff. And my goal was to restore that level of collegiality, to restore fun at work, to allow physicians and particularly surgeons to do what they do best, which is take good care of our patients and take all the, in quote, BS off their plate, regulatory, administrative, by building those relationships. I personally feel that I have been able to build trust and credibility. I always feel credibility is something that has to be 100%. If you say, hey, Phil, the CMO is 99% credible, it means you're not credible at all. And as you all know, it takes a long time to build trust and credibility, probably more among surgeons or orthopedic surgeons than many other specialties. And it only takes a stupid statement or an action to completely throw it down the drain. And so one thing that I've been privileged with for my entire life and career, that I've always been happy at what I did. And I think that resilience by sheer luck is part of my genome. And one of my main goals as CMO, aside of assuring quality, patient safety, and driving the clinical excellence agenda, is truly to support the physicians. And there's many success stories, almost to the point where I traded healing one patient at a time with the blade of a knife to scaling or amplifying my work to healing an entire community with the stroke of a pen. That's not very rewarding because, as you know, as surgeons, when we drive home at night and you just had a successful surgery, you rotted a femur and the patient walks home the next day, is a sense of accomplishment. Whereas the CMO projects are all long-term. You don't have an immediate reward. You don't get a tap on the shoulder. So you have to be able to live in this conundrum of foggy type of recognition long-term. And the few times where I feel as successful as rotting a femur or fixing a pelvis is when I'm able to heal a physician who is about to go down the wrong path, and the system is about to fail that physician. They're thrown into citizenship committee, credentials, peer review. They're put on some type of contracts, voluntary remediation agreements. They're at risk of losing their privileges or being reported to the National Practitioner Data Bank. And that's the reward that I personally feel is when I can prevent that and put them back on a path of healing. And the coolest thing that I see is when they don't just restore the fun at work and the excellent work they do, but truly excel and feel that they are better after that long journey, including, as you know, we take it home, happiness at home, family, happiness at work, and then the respect by the staff and the team come back and saying Dr. XYZ is now from maybe the least liked surgeon in the OR to the most popular surgeon in the OR. That's my brief summary on my background and the reason why I, in quote, switched to the dark side. People say, why would you do that? I find it very rewarding, and I hope that I can contribute some value in the conversation here tonight. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Phil. And we'll be watching any questions being put into the chat as best we can. I may have Paul helping me out on that as well. I know there's your mission is to do it differently and restore that collegiality and fun. What are some tools, or how have you been able to accomplish that? Because there are many that have done it the way that has been less appealing, been more confrontational, and challenging to deal with.
Well, first of all, it's unequivocally clear that arguably there's not a single physician or surgeon in the world who gets up in the morning with the intent of creating conflict, creating a complication, having adverse patient outcomes, or being reported because of hostile behavior in the OR. And from the moment where we get up in the morning until we get home in the evening and wish we could go back 24 hours to revoke the things that happened, I think a lot of physicians are set up for failure by the system. And it's our obligation not to rush to conclusion and to understand that whatever you call it, an unprofessional surgeon, a difficult surgeon, there's a rationale for that. Maybe they are worried about the safety of their patients. If you have a patient open in the OR and you don't have the instruments and implants you need and you're being set up for failure. And in this day and age, 20 years ago, we kind of dominated the OR, but in this day and age, anyone can write you up. It could be the anesthesia tech student behind the curtain feeling that you were unprofessional, to the scrub tech, and they report it. It goes up the chain of command. And so my goal is to filter those with common sense. And I've been truly able to take 90, maybe 95% of these so-called occurrence reports off the plate. I will pick up the phone and have a phone call and a brief collegial conversation, or what we now branded as a coffee cup conversation, where we just have a cup of coffee and I want to get their perspective, follow up with resolution, and that's it. And the notion is that as human beings, we judge others by the impact that they have on us, and we judge ourselves by our intent. And truly, we should switch it around and try to understand the intent when somebody impacted us the way they did, and understand the impact we have on others. And with these type of conversations, we're truly able to promote reflection. And it doesn't matter how far in your career you are. Some of the most amazing healing stories that I've personally witnessed in the past 4 years were actually seasoned surgeons, accomplished spine surgeons, complex reconstruction surgeons. And they may have had that epiphany later in their life at the age of 50, 55, or 60, and restored the joy of their work. I know those are fairly generic answers. You're like, show me that really works, but that's my experience from the past 4 years.
Well, I mean, I think they're important pearls, right? So it sounds like, just your comment about the intent of others rather than our intent and their actions flipped in that round. That sounds like a pretty cool take-home message. The concept of the coffee cup conversation, I think we've heard about that, but might want to hear a little bit more about that. But maybe the start I would have is just the comment that you made about the perspective of the surgeon. And so, what do you find is critical to that, bringing out that perspective of the surgeon?
No, that's a great question. We tend to rush to conclusions. If I hear someone's perspective, at first I feel, oh, I totally get that story. This patient was right and that person was wrong. And then you go back and you get the other person's perspective. And more frequently than not, almost unequivocally, there's a completely different side of the story, a different rationale. And the truth is somewhere in between, and to bring those people together to start understanding each other. And ultimately, it's not too distinct on how we interact with our patients. I round every day through the entire hospital, and every time I go to a unit, I ask the nurses, please let me round on your 5 most difficult patients. And they know immediately who they are. The room numbers point them out. And my notion is there is no difficult patient. There are patients that are suffering, and they may be loud and obnoxious, and maybe because of uncertainty, suffering, pain, or because nobody ever listens to them. And you sit down and they're yelling, and you hold their hand and ask, when is the last time someone carefully listened to you? And every single time, that's the breaking point where typically they may break down in tears and say, nobody ever listens to me and I'm anxious, I don't know what's going on. By the way, we don't do a good job as physicians. Patients are typically the last people to know what's truly going on and what the plan is. Or to ask them, tell me your biggest fear or anxiety at this time, or tell me what makes you happy. And with that, you build that connection. And the conversations that we have around whatever you want to call it, we've all been called these names, the difficult surgeon or unprofessional behavior. There's a reason behind that. And to listen and to understand means showing empathy, which means to attempt to understand even if we disagree with that person's actions, and then bringing both parties together and finding a common denominator. More frequently than not, that's the foundation of those two people who were initially adversaries becoming long-term friends over a situation of crisis, and because they start to understand and respect each other.
Phil, I want to relay a few questions in the chat, and for the time being, just because of our current attendance, we're going to stay in the main room. But this first one, I might actually just let Richard share it in his own language. Richard, do you want to? I mean, it's written out quite well, but I'll let you say it. What's the question that you have for Phil?
So if Phil, thank you for doing this. I've become a huge believer in, the concept that culture trumps all. And I find that at times, some of these things that we're thinking, some of the things that you're talking about, you as the CMO can be overruled. You can be to some extent, they try to control you, the CEO, the COO. I've seen that in our place where a CMO that I had tremendous respect for and did great work, but, was told one time, we survived before we had a CMO and we can survive again without one. So it put a lot of pressure on that individual. So I get, so that's really it. As the CMO, how do you see your relationships with the rest, with the C-suite, and how were you able to, or are you able to, to be independent?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Thanks for the question. And it's an extremely important question because, first of all, if you get rid of all the CMOs across the United States, hospitals will continue to function, and the physician medical staffs do well. Actually, by CMS, if you look all the way back on the conditions of participation that are about 40 years outdated, the only requirement is you need to have a CNO, someone to oversee the nurses. There is no mandate to have a CMO. And actually, the medical staff is designed as a self-regulatory, independent entity with their own officers to remain separate from administration. And that's a good thing. And now we created this weird conundrum of a CMO that's an administrator who is a physician. And I see the role as a bridge between administration and medical staff. And if we're smart and we use our capability of influencing others, then you are able to influence your CEO and COO, because you think about for 1 second, if the CMO is the physician leader who is able to build those true relationships, because at the core, if you ask me today, I get the paycheck from HCA, but my core values are, I am a physician, I am a surgeon. And the only reason I'm an administrator because I want to be that bridge, and I want to make it easier for the medical staff, maybe more than any president of medical staff may be able to leverage because they're not part of the C-suite. So ultimately, what I can leverage is physicians are typically not employed. They're private practice aligned with a hospital. They can choose to take their patients wherever they want. If we don't build and sustain those relationships, the business will go down the drain, because ultimately the only reason patients come to a hospital is because of the physicians, not for administrators, ancillary services, nursing. And that's a huge leverage that the CMO has if we're smart about it. And if we are able to influence others and to attend those meetings, to be at the table. And I have never felt that I was left out or overruled because of strategy or operational planning. Actually, quite the opposite. I took on a lot of operational and strategic roles and opportunities to be part of that. My biggest leverage right now is we just got our annual physician engagement survey back. And I started in this hospital where I'm at now just in February 2020 when COVID started. And the engagement survey was truly down the drain. And we now have one of the highest percentile rankings of engagement and the rating of administration. And the CEO and COO, they know that that is navigated and leveraged by the CMO. So again, I could get fired any day and business as usual will continue. I may even be relieved to no longer be in this position, but I do enjoy it. And I see myself as, again, I've said it before, the bridge between administration and the physician workforce. And the testament is I give everyone my personal cell phone number and they use that. They call me, they text me, and I help resolve problems. And if I can't, I tend not to overpromise and underdeliver. When I do, I apologize. But the key is not just to listen and understand. The key is to come back with real solutions, because you've all seen these administrators that have all this fancy business language and like, what did they just say? Did they even understand what the concern is? And does that mean that this will be resolved or not? And that's the most important part of credibility. I actually just got a coincidental compliment today from one of our physician relations persons. She said, I just ran into Dr. XYZ, a busy spine surgeon, and he said, I really like the CMO because he's real. Initially, I thought he's just a fake administrator, but then it takes a long time to build trust and respect. And I think that's possibly the answer to your question, Richard, and I hope I did answer it appropriately.
Thanks so much, Phil. I'm going to read Robert's question and then he can add to it if he wants. So it says, as a coach, I have now had several surgical clients who were referred because of their non-clinical behaviors and struggles. Several of them ultimately transitioned out of their institution after working with me. In all those situations, it was viewed as very successful by the client. My question is, how does a CMO view such a result if a surgeon leaves for a situation that might be better for that individual?
Can you elaborate on the question, whether I feel
Sure. So
it's a success if they leave?
Yeah, that's, I guess, so I'm a now retired surgeon, trained as executive coach. And because of that, I think have kind of developed this niche of working with surgeons who are struggling. And as I mentioned, there's several that after working with them, realized that really, while they had issues that we worked on, a lot of it was related to the situation they were in was not ideal for them as an individual. And not through any encouragement of mine, but through facilitated conversation, they ultimately realized that staying in, say, an academic department was not well suited for them. So these individuals subsequently left, and I've touched base with them subsequently, and all of them were really glad they made the switch. But I've often wondered, how did the CMO in each of those respective institutions view that engagement? Was it money well spent to employ me as a coach to help these individuals transition out?
I see what you're saying. Well, personally, I would always see it as a loss if we lose a colleague from my hospital. However, if they are more successful and happier, it probably means two things. That one, for whatever reason, we had not built that culture. And I heard Richard loud and clear, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it takes about 5 years to build a culture. And if the culture is not there and people leave, I think we should debrief and ask ourselves, what can we do going forward to be able to retain the good physicians? And ultimately, I'd be happy for that individual if they're in a better place, because not everyone is meant for academics or for a high stress environment. And we only live once. And if we're not happy at what we do every day, then we definitely have to look into changing. My philosophy has been for all these years, you need to have fun 80% of the time, and 20% is hardship, and we all know it. But if you don't have fun 80% of the time of what you do, then you need to look into changing, and I would support it. And I don't care about the money spent. It's really about the person.
Greg, were you wanting to make a comment? Or no, just swatting at a fly? All right. Let me, and I'm going to bounce around a little bit, but Muyabat, I'm going to share your question because I think it's in addition to all these very good questions. How do we get rid of the label of difficult or disruptive surgeon? It seems that this is a label that creates further blocks to listening.
Yeah, it's interesting because we use it all the time, and I just did several times tonight. I believe that as surgeons, we have not been as proactive in engaging for our own well-being and our own tribe sticking together. Nurses have done a tremendous job in aligning, and at this point in time, everyone except for the surgeons or the physicians are able to push a button and throw someone into peer review or label them with whatever stigma you choose. And what we do is typically we shut up and move on. So we have not done a good job at building a lobby for ourselves. And then there's all the competition in different practices and competing interests between specialty groups. I think what we have to do is to restore collegiality and to support each other. And that term should long be gone, because I can tell you stories of, if I tell you how it's portrayed and everyone would agree, 100% consensus, this is the classic paradigm of a disruptive surgeon. Then I tell you the surgeon's perspective and we'll revoke, say, oh no, I totally get where that surgeon's coming from. It takes a long way. But again, to be honest with you, that's one of the reasons I took this job, is to be able to make that difference and to advocate for our colleagues.
Any other comments from regarding Muyabat's question about the disruptive surgeon or the difficult surgeon?
Is it true? I mean, you get reports on all sorts of individuals. What percentage are surgeons? What percentage are internal medicine or non-surgeons? What percentage are nurses?
And sorry, what's your question, Greg?
So, you know, if you have 100 physician complaints, what percentage are surgeons and what percentage are non-surgeons?
Yeah, for some reason, the high risk, high acuity entities are more likely to be reported. Typically, it's the orthosurgeons, spine surgeons, and neurosurgeons. That's what it has been. And I don't know if there's a selection bias towards who chooses that path, and maybe a little bit of the sense of entitlement because going through lengthy training, and without exception, they are clinically excellent and they fail in the non-technical humanistic relationship type of endeavors. But if that's your question, it's truly more specialty surgeons. I've not seen in those 4 years a primary care physician being thrown into peer review for some reason. However, it's easy for primary care physicians sitting on all these committees, including MEC, to judge around what's happening behind the red line when they have no clue what it means to be behind the red line, what it means to have an open spine and you make one mistake and the patient will be paralyzed, or a big abdominal surgery and the patient may die, or open heart surgery. And that's, again, a problem of us as physicians to be able to align across all these specialties and attempt to understand what it means to be a highly specialized surgeon as opposed to a generalist, hospitalist, primary care physician. And I don't mean to be judgmental. And by the way, I'll add one more thing to the CMO discussion. 95% of all CMOs I know, HCA has 186 hospitals. They are hospitalists, internal medicine doctors. And becoming a CMO is a logical promotion in their path of their career. And again, I'm not being judgmental. For me, it was a demotion. I took a 50% pay cut, and I did it because it was the right thing to do at that stage of my career. I just turned 50, I'm 55 now. And I felt that for me, resiliency means I want to do purposeful, meaningful work. And I was going to look at my life through a postmortem. What will I want to have achieved? How much longer can I be a good surgeon as maybe my judgment skills, my technical skills, my eyesight starts fading? I would rather do that transition on my own terms than to have someone else tell me when to do that. But to get back to your question, beyond the doubt, it's the specialists that are probably 80–90% of the times the ones thrown into peer review and investigations.
Can I make a comment? Just, from a lot of the work that I've done in wellness and a lot of the things I've seen as a chair over the past 10, 12 years, I think there are certainly situations where I see surgeons who are really strong surgeons, but they get into maybe a stressful situation, they aren't getting the support. Those are the cases where I think that disruptive label can be incredibly damaging. But I will also say that there are surgeons who really are disruptive. And I think that one of the problems is that if you really look at, if you look at a lot of this literature, individuals aren't changing a lot over time. And these same behaviors that are getting them into trouble also got them into trouble in residency, in medical school, in high school. And so I think that I think we do have to take some responsibility for who we accept. What are the qualities that we are looking for? And a lot of this, all the specialties that you've described, they are all the ones that, without a doubt, you needed to have the really high USMLE scores. You needed to have, research and all of, a lot of things to get into those specialties. So they've tended to attract people that, and this is a little bit of a bias, I think, on my part. I think that if we really looked at these groups, I think you'd see a fair number that are on the spectrum. They're just, it's part of what makes them successful, but it's also what makes it really challenging them to read other human beings. We've all heard of the person who, the great surgeon, the great technical surgeon, but who's got a horrible bedside manner. So it's tough, but I do think that there are times, I've had, a couple of people who I have had to have those discussions with. Where are you going to be best? Where are you going to be happiest? This isn't maybe the situation that's best for you. So it's hard. It's hard to know.
Yeah,
Can I add on to that real quick? I think you're right, Richard, but I think the problem is that people don't take the time to distinguish the two, right? So everybody gets labeled as disruptive, not because they believe they're disruptive, to Greg's point, it's because it will get them the action that they're looking for, right? It's essentially a weaponized word. Whereas if I say Jeff is disruptive, I know that Jeff has to go sit in somebody's office, right? And me as the reporter gets whatever satisfaction out of that. Now, what's required for surgeons is we need somebody else that's going to ask the right questions. And the questions that need to be asked, especially in these high-risk specialties, are number one, what was going on with the patient when this event happened? And two, what is that surgeon's perspective of the situation? And too often, no questions get asked. They just take other people's words for it. And people need to accept that that label is very damaging. So if you don't do the due diligence to see if that person warrants that label, you can essentially ruin someone's career in a place by labeling them as disruptive, because that's not something that they can shake, and they turn into kind of a reclamation project as opposed to something that people want to actually support.
So excellent comments. And Phil, I think maybe you can help us out as our guest that, there's a common theme is the two perspectives. Robert asked the follow-up of kind of, can you speak to the conundrum of balancing the accountability of the surgeon, but also with the empathy and compassion for that struggling surgeon?
Yeah, that's a very challenging question, but obviously I'm a big fan of accountability, and my middle name is accountability. I believe that accountability means that you're held accountable independent of the outcome. Whereas our classic paradigm of blame and shame was you can do whatever you want, but if it goes wrong, we'll point fingers. And holding people accountable and at the same time having empathy and compassion for their situation, where they come from, it's such a delicate balance. And sometimes we do ourselves a disservice. I have seen the citizenship committees run under the medical staff purview by, let's say, president-elect of medical staff. And almost to the point of an inquisition, one of their colleagues has to show up, and there's 20 people around the table, and we are taking their time, and they may have had a sleepless night the night before. They don't know what it means being reported to citizenship. Am I going to lose my license? And now everyone at that table has the entitlement to ask questions. Is everything okay at home? Are we missing something? Is there something with substance abuse going on? Like, seriously, that's how we treat our own colleagues just because we're empowered to do that? So it's a very slippery slope of retaining respect and dignity in these type of conversations. And every physician knows it. You smell when there is something fake or scripted going on, or whether someone really cares. And at the same time, we owe accountability to our patients. And I believe that balance works well. If you walk into my hospital, you'll immediately get the sense of a coherent, cohesive, collegial medical staff. You walk down the hall, people are talking and smiling in spite of the pandemic and everything horrific that is going on. And in other hospitals, you see how people evade each other and there's rarely communication. I believe that first impression you get is very frequently a surrogate marker of the culture and the collegiality at that hospital. And it's not easy. There's not a textbook that tells you how to solve that. But I think us as more senior physicians and physician leaders, one thing, and to Richard's point earlier, one thing we don't do well, we don't select residents well once they're in residency. We feel that firing a resident is a failure of the program, when in truth, if you keep promoting them, it's exactly what's going to happen, what Richard was alluding to. They become these horrible human beings. And it's painful for me to currently watch this TV streaming series on Dr. Death, a spine surgeon who did horrible things. Well, somebody set him up to that path. Somebody kept promoting him through residency, maybe not holding him accountable, maybe not teaching him how to be diligent and careful and meticulous in indications and technique. And ultimately, now you have millions of Americans watching that show and think what a horrible person that is. But ultimately, it's us who screen and interview medical students and residents and fellows and never pull the brake when there's a horrible person. The one resident that I have ever fired during residency was a gentleman who was a professional gambler. And instead of taking care of patients, he gambled online poker games. And I had admonished him several times and tried to coach him. And ultimately, the tipping point was that he wrote an HMP that stated brisk capillary refill in all toes on bilateral lower extremities. And I went to him and asked him again, have you seen this patient? Are we talking about the same patient? And he said, yes. This gentleman is a bilateral amputee. There is no brisk capillary refilling. So he had never even seen the patient. And I'm convinced that we protected not just hundreds or thousands of subsequent patients, but even we protected that individual who's probably better served not being a physician. And maybe the same could have applied to this surgeon, Chris Dunn, who's now all over the news. It's easier to just let go, not to speak up. How often do you reprimand someone who doesn't wash their hands when they walk into a room? We don't, because it's much easier to look away than saying, Jeff, I just saw you not wash your hands. You know, when we do it, what you permit, you promote, and they look up to you, then the students think it's okay because the professor doesn't do it. And so we have to kind of take a mirror and look at ourselves. And are we choosing the path of least resistance, or are we truly advocating accountability, which is not easy, day by day, year over year?
So, Phil, I'm going to take some comments that you made earlier and kind of twist them a little bit and see what you think of this thought. So you had mentioned the concept a little bit of flipping around, you know, what's the intent of the others and our actions. So right now, the general perception is that those professionalism committees are pretty aggressive and on the attack of finding fault with the physician. Maybe they could be the ones demonstrating more empathy and compassion. And then the surgeon who maybe is feeling attacked can also focus, and they're kind of worried about their defense and not being attacked. Maybe if they put their focus on what they could be accountable for, then that might create a win-win, because you're getting the accountability from the person that you want having a little bit more accountability. The committee wants that, but they spend so much time on that, it's almost overload to the recipient, right? Wait, you're making me accountable for what the nurse did? You're making me accountable for what the tech did? You're making me accountable for the anesthesiologist? Like, all of a sudden, that's a little excessive on what's accountable, right? And so what do you think of those thoughts? Just the committee having more compassion and empathy, and the surgeon having a little bit more accountability.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Jeff. And think about it for 1 second. The professionalism committee is hostile. Well, who is the professionalism committee? It's us. It's the medical staff. And again, choosing the path of least resistance could also mean I choose not to participate in committees because I'm so busy treating patients, writing papers, writing grants, doing research. I have all these hobbies. So it's almost an obligation for folks who have those humanistic, non-technical skills to seek those assignments in committee functions and officer roles to make a difference, because otherwise it's again those who seek recognition and titles rather than those who do it for the true intrinsic reason of supporting their colleagues. And with that comes empathy and compassion. And once we role model it, it spreads like a communicable disease, because when others see that a surgeon or a chief medical officer can show vulnerability, when I'm in a room with a patient and I shed tears with them and I don't lose my stature or credibility, and you do the same advocating and speaking up at those medical staff venues, which ironically, my only leverage I have is influence. I am a non-voting member of medical staff because I'm an administrator. I have nothing to say at MEC, at credentials, except I can speak up and appeal to common sense. And more frequently than not, I've been able to make a very compelling argument in favor of a physician who was about to go down the wrong route. So it's an imperative for us, everyone on this call, which we've already done, otherwise we wouldn't be on this call, to step up and seek those leadership positions of influence in order to be able to make a difference and control the agenda and not give it to others.
Can I ask a question? So, in my experience, you're generally looking, when you're talking about a medical staff, it's not as though there's a large proportion of the staff that are disruptive or are the ones being brought in front of, the ECMS or professionalism committees. It's a small group, and it tends to be the same group over and over again. And since we're a group that, preaching to the choir, we believe in coaching, and we believe that coaching can change individuals, can make real change. So, and then if you take it to the next step where, generally when you're talking about surgeons, it costs a health system $500,000 to $750,000 every time a surgeon leaves to bring on somebody else, get them up to speed, and all of that. So what do you think of sort of within an organization, having the funding to truly, do the coaching? And I've forgotten his name because he's not showing up on my screen right now. Robert, because you were talking about it, you're organized, you were being brought in for coaching of individuals. That's something that, I'd be interested in hearing sort of thoughts as to how we can get that into other organizations through the CMO position, and Philip, have you been able to do something like that as well?
That's a great point. May defer to Robert first, if you don't mind, to share your perspective.
Well, the institution where I practiced was very supportive of coaching. And in fact, that's how I got interested in it. I was the chief of the Department of Surgery and had a few surgeons who benefited from coaching, and I was very intrigued by that. The work that I've done typically has been outside my institution, and it's highly variable how many institutions are willing to invest in that. I know that I'm a pediatric surgeon, and I know that some of my peers at some of the children's hospitals around the country actually now have internal coaching resource. And I think that's really foresighted and a really important thing to do. The one hooker with that, though, is that when you have an internal resource, is I think a key part of the coaching relationship is that confidentiality, that the surgeon has to have full trust that his or her coach is for them and doesn't have the intention of the organization. That's why I was able to help these 3 surgeons transition out of their institutions. So in answer to your question, I think I agree with everyone. It's a really valuable resource. I wish it were more available at more institutions, but it seems to be very variable by institution.
Phil, before you comment, I'm going to integrate what Robert just said, and actually the whole conversation, and what Muibat's adding in the chat, that, is coaching being brought in too late? But the other twist that let me start with that. Do you think coaching's being brought in too late?
Well, I would say to Richard and Robert's point, it is clearly undervalued. And again, like Richard said, we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to recruit, to relocate, to onboard. We give them a welcome wagon, we give them an income guarantee, and then they're on their own. And there are no resources left, because most physicians practice through alignment, not employment. And facilities and health systems put all these resources into leadership training for nurses and ancillary staff, executive development, but not physicians. And so I did something not too dissimilar from Robert. I just took it upon myself to start acting as a coach, and I've done that successfully. And the notion of 100% confidentiality is imperative. And what I tell my colleagues is, as a CMO, if I'm not 100% confidential, if you don't trust me 100%, you think I'm just another executive administrator, I could not work in my role for another day, because my credibility would be gone. And again, if the only leverage you have is to influence, then that's the only means of being able to work with the medical staff, is to have their trust. And I have been the successful coach of at least a dozen senior colleagues. I would challenge the notion that it's too late. I agree we should prospectively, proactively coach, but I don't believe it's too late. Sometimes when that red flag shows up, which invariably is when they're thrown into one of those investigative committees, it's not too late. I've seen it many times that folks turn around. It's like a wake-up call. I mean, physicians are smart people, and once they know how others think, and typically I tell them, look, I'm here to support you. You're now at risk of losing your license. You're at risk of being reported to the National Practitioner Data Bank. You will never be able to get rid of that. You'll have to disclose it every time you apply for privileges. Let's seek the path of remediation. And when you meet with that committee, the first thing you'll do is you'll take full responsibility for your actions and you'll say, I am sorry. I know you've never said that. You'll say it, and you'll say it 5 times during the fair hearing, and you'll blow them away. You'll be reinstated, and then you will rebuild your own career based on your own choice and not others telling you what to do and destroying your career. And obviously I do that free of charge. That's the reason I took my CMO job. So I'm not an official coach, but we truly do not have those resources. Back to Richard's point, that they're not allocated for physician coaching.
Robert, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so an interesting phenomenon, again, it may be unique to my institution and my university, but an increasing number of the young leaders, people coming in who are assuming a division chief role or clinical section role, are asking for coaches, which I view as a very positive thing. It's the realization that in order for me to be an effective leader, I'm going to need some help. And so I find that very encouraging, and I hope that's a sign of a national trend that people are more receptive to the idea of coaching and the value of preventing problems before they occur or making you more effective leader.
I couldn't agree more.
I would echo that. We just gave a symposium for the American Orthopedic Association, and one of the panel members was Christy Weber, who's the first female president of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. And she was talking about how when she negotiated her contract, for her academic position, she included coaching and encourages people to do that, to include coaching as part of your, recruitment package. And so I think it is becoming more common. I think the issue that we struggle with as coaches is that historically coaching has been for remediation for this disruptive behavior. And so if you say you've had coaching, it's like, what'd you do? What's wrong with you? If we're switching topics or back to what we were on before, my question is do you see situations where the system won't let the surgeon change? I mean, in dysfunctional relationships, in families or whatever, you do fine outside of your family, but when you get back in your family, you follow into that old behavior and whatever. So do you see situations where the surgeon can't change because the system doesn't think they can, and it goes back to that weaponizing the disruptive label of once you've been labeled as disruptive, are the nurses in the OR or other people going to ever let you change and get better?
So Phil, let me put a spin on this, because you can possibly answer that at the same time as we're kind of coming to the close of our session. We brought you on because Paul and I have a lot of respect for you and following what you've been doing over the last several years. So you've demonstrated a way to do it. And I'm just curious, is there messages that you can convey to people that are in those kind of places that Greg's referring to, where they've been labeled this and the system isn't going to give them the opportunity to change that label? What do they do? Or maybe if it's even simpler, I'm at one of those places and I don't have one of you, a person like you there to be my CMO, and somebody there calls me into their office. But do I ask them for a cup of coffee, or do I just show up in their office?
It's such an interesting question, because that's now the reverse from my position. I used to steer far away from the executive suite. I wanted nothing to do with them. I think that was a mistake, because as much as now as CMO, if the first thing, let's say I call Greg because there's a problem and I have never met you, I say, hey, this is Phil, the CMO, can we talk? How am I going to build a relationship with you? It's irreversibly torn. However, if I first meet you and say, hey, I'm Phil, and just want to meet you, let's have a cup of coffee or have a beer after work. And then 5 months later, I'm like, hey, Greg, remember I'm the CMO. I need to talk to you about a problem that I just overheard. That's much different. Similar, if you, Jeff, are now in trouble and now for the first time you walk into the CMO's office, you're already guilty walking in, as opposed to why not build a relationship with the CMO, leverage the CMO long before you ever need the CMO. And when that time comes, it'll be natural walking into the CMO's office and having a cup of coffee, hoping that every CMO in the United States has the same incentive to do their job, which is to support the medical staff. What I have seen with HCA, one huge advantage is scale. And 186 facilities, I went through a physician leadership academy for a year. I was with all these dozens of CMO colleagues from all different specialties. And yes, intriguingly, there's many surgeons. There's at least 5 surgeons I know, general surgeons, trauma surgeons, orthopedic surgeons that seek that path. And the one thing I've noticed is that there's a selection bias towards becoming a CMO is your ego must be the smallest possible common denominator in that work group, because there's really nothing in it for you. It's not what's in it for me, it's what can I do for you. And that was intriguing when I met with all these CMOs. So I hope that your CMO at your facility will be driven by the same values. And once you build this relationship early on, I couldn't foresee how they would not accommodate you in their office for a cup of coffee. And 3 months later, 3 years later, or never, if there's a problem, you walk back in, I'm like, dude, I really need your support. I'm in a weird spot. And that's different because then you've already built that relationship. So don't steer away from the CMO office.
Thank you, Phil. So with respect to everyone's time, I think we'll close our session for tonight. And on the closing, I also have a few housekeeping items. First of all, I want to thank Phil for his time and energy and his perspective and leadership of a fantastic conversation. I also want to thank all the attendees. Several of them are folks that have gone through or in our SurgeonMasters physician coach training. Our goal with these SurgeonMasters E-Gagements is to support each other and take away something we can apply to our lives and practices. With that in mind, hopefully those here live and anyone listening to this in its recorded format, what did you learn and what can you take away? And what would you want to learn and engage in future E-Gagement opportunities? So help us figure out some discussion topics, help us pick some great guests like Phil, because we want to create value for each of us in ways we can't get through potentially our home institutions or our home practice environments. Feel free to email us some suggestions. We do have an upcoming community E-Gagement scheduled with Dr. Brent Jackson, general surgeon and CMO. We hope to announce that date very soon. So watch out for that in any of our emails or announcements. For me, there's quite a few takeaways, so I might end up listening back to some of the recording, but certainly that phrase of, switching things around a little bit to what is the intent of the other and what are our actions? Because I agree, we tend to do the reverse. So that was one of my takeaways amongst others. I'm going to share, that Brene Brown describes connection as the energy between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. It's been a pleasure spending this hour with all of you, connecting with all of you, and I look forward to our next opportunity. Practice your best, everyone. Ciao.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. You all have a great night. It was such a fun night. Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
everybody.